There was a subtle joke in our title here. This is a paper essentially asking, do teens avoid dating their friends' exes? And there's lots of vulgar ways I could have described that. I decided not to and just went with put your own inappropriate title here. So that's where we're going. And I'm going to kind of tell how this evolved a little bit in ways that is, most of you are going to be quite familiar with around here, at least on some level. The paper that Peter Bierman and Kate Stovall and Jim Moody published now over 20 years ago on romantic relationships amongst high schoolers. This was a striking paper, but not for the reason often that it is cited as being a striking paper, and that is that half of the kids in the school's romantic relationships were connected, and this kind of giant part at the top was actually entirely expected by network researchers. What wasn't expected was that it would be connected in the way that it was connected. And so then they kind of delved into that paper to ask kind of what are the informal rules that people follow that might lead us to have a structure that looks like this, right? And their primary finding was around this, was basically if you have four people, excuse me, and they're in two relationships at time one, and subsequently both of those break up, what happens at time two when one of them forms? So when Carol and Ted become romantically involved at wave two, what happens between Bob and Alice? And their finding around this was that people tend to avoid dating their ex-partner's current partner's ex-partner. Right? Yes, I've practiced that a few times in teaching this. But they also point out that this is an unarticulated norm, right? So when I teach this, I always ask students kind of what rules do people form, do people follow when they're forming romantic relationships? And I have not once had students tell me that they avoid dating their ex-partner's current partner's ex-partners. But once you tell them this, they can kind of logic their way to thinking that it makes sense. But they do often express a particular norm. And that's the one we're going to talk about today. And I could put, this is from Mean Girls, which is now an increasingly dated reference as well. But I could show you, any number of TV shows. In fact, I've seen it happen in 2 TV shows in the last week. An expression of this same statement, that it's just inappropriate to date your friend's exes is a popular perceived version. I'm going to make the case that this is both a theoretically interesting question to us sociologically, and it's a really kind of fascinating, problematic, I don't know how to phrase this appropriately yet, both data and methodological problem to deal with that we're going to kind of work out as well. So that's where we're going. So simply in terms of translating this into network terms, this becomes just a straightforward question of whether or not teens do avoid dating their friends' exes, and we can represent it like this, right? So if I and K are friends, if I and J were in a romantic relationship previously, but they no longer are, what happens between K and J in terms of the likely formation of a romantic relationship between them? And the popular prohibition would suggest that it should not form. That's the simple version of it. We should think of this as a taboo. I'm going to make the contention that we can actually really think of this as a pretty direct application of a lot of kind of foundational theoretical ideas sociologically. This prediction, and in particular, it's a specific form of Granovetter's version of the forbidden triad. It's what he refers to it as, that our close ties should be linked to one another. If we're close friends with two people, we spend a lot of time with them. We have shared activities with them. We have shared interests with them, and therefore there's an increased likelihood of those closing and becoming having relationships as well. And so the way he talked about it is we shouldn't see what we in the network terms often refer to as an open two path, right? So relationships where we have kind of strong ties to two people who are not connected to one another. So you could think of this as, I'm in a romantic relationship, I'm in a friendship. They shouldn't be in a romantic relationship either kind of in the future or previously. We should avoid this kind of absence if we break up, right? Or we could have the joint. We won't talk about overlapping in time. That's a separate question than today. But there's lots of reasons we might expect this avoidance, that we would avoid this kind of forbidden triad structure that is very consistent with Granovetter's version of this. So that's not, I don't think I have to go too far to make the suggestion that we can kind of wrap this popularly perceived norm into kind of classic sets of sociological expectations based on a variety of those. I'm going to make the case that doing so requires some complications that we'll deal with. But before we do that, we're also going to recognize that it's possible that the alternative is there as well, right? There's a lot of reasons we might suspect that we would date our friends' exes. In schools, there's only so many kids there, right? And so the possibility of who you could have relationships with is constrained in particular ways that might lead to an increased likelihood of that occurring. If we recognize homophily, that we tend to be friends with people who are similar to ourselves, we also tend to date people who are similar to ourselves, then there's probably homophily there as well. So they might be more attractive as partners at that level. There's also more kind of structural reasons for this about how kind of consolidation of relationships leads us to kind of have things that are associated in similar ways to patterns externally that are likely to lead those relationships to form in ways that are kind of pulling together our interests that are diverse into kind of similarly overlapping pools. And there's also external forces that might lead us to expect this. So all that to say, we could really think of this as a set of competing hypotheses. The popular norm would suggest that we would think about the kind of primary hypothesis, if you will, is that people will avoid dating their friends' exes, and the kind of competing version is that maybe they actually have a preference towards it. I'm going to make a few claims that are going to suggest that why this perhaps relatively simple perception or simple idea is actually really hard to test. The first is that it requires a type of data that we unfortunately frequently don't have in the social sciences these days, and that is what variously gets referred to as multi-layer or multiplex network data. There is a difference between those for our purposes. We can treat them as interchangeable, but the basic notion is that we're thinking about networks that fundamentally involve multiple types of relationships simultaneously. So in this case, we have a romantic tie and we have a friendship tie that matter and how they interact with one another. And I say this is problematic because we in the network world, unfortunately, have spent the last 25 to 30 years spending almost all of our time collecting one network tie at a time and kind of ignoring this notion of multiplexity. And I would say that that's a more recent phenomenon because if we go back to how like social network research started, multiplexity was assumed and kind of foundational to the way we think about things. If you look at like Elizabeth Bott's work or a number of other people, like the idea of thinking about relationships as anything other than multiplex was actually kind of antithetical to the way networks was originally formulated. And I would argue that we as a field would be served well to kind of go back to those original roots. And this is an example of that. The second thing is that the methods for dealing with multiplex or multi-level data is actually quite complex as well. We've had a really kind of strong and useful advance in network methods over, I would say, starting descriptively in the 80s and into kind of the inferential methods that kind of found their wide uses by the late I never know what to call those, the aughts. Let's call it that. We now have methods for kind of modeling networks that are uniplex, that only are one relationship tie at a time, but how we translate that into these multiplex things has also been complicated. So a lack of data and a lack of methods was a reason that we couldn't actually answer this question for a while. And we still actually can't exactly do it, and I'll show you how we get around that in a minute. But before I get to that, I'm also going to recognize that I've talked about the avoidance of a pattern. The avoidance of a pattern, though, could arrive. We could have two very different processes that could lead to new patterns that are both consistent with the avoidedness that I'm talking about. So I want to step you through both of those. So the first idea is that at time one, we have a friendship between I and K. We have a romantic tie between I and J. If at time two, the romantic tie between I and J dissolves, what else could happen is effectively what I'm asking in time two in ways that are consistent with the prohibition. That's what we want to kind of ask. So the first is the kind of articulated version of this, is that if we're still friends between I and K at that time, then the romantic tie at the base should not be observed, right? We should avoid dating our friends' exes. Alternatively, something that would still be consistent with not having these open two paths, but is a fundamentally different process, is that if by time two, now, instead of K and J avoiding having a romantic relationship, they do have a romantic relationship, then the friendship between I and K could dissolve, and that would still keep us kind of consistent with the expectation, because now I'm no longer friends with the people who are dating my ex. And that's more kind of acceptable in balanced terms. So that's kind of the separate process by which we could end up in the same kind of pattern of avoidance, but they're really different in terms of how we would model these that we're going to get to when we think about multiplex ties. Trying to figure out, I think for now that's sufficient for that. So we're going to leverage a unique data set. I you might think we would use Ad Health at this point. There's a number of reasons we aren't using Ad Health. First and foremost, for me, I could have been in Ad Health. It's starting to feel a little dated when we're looking at school one, like wave 1 and wave 2 when I was in high school. That's reason 1. Reason 2, I've also actually been told that you're not allowed to put those 2 layers together. The romantic relationship tie, which was the one that was kind of one of the big sources of controversy on getting it off the ground, and the friendship tie. I asked at one point in time, and Jim Moody, he said, I don't think I could do. He said he didn't think he could do that. So there's pragmatic limitation, but also we really only have 2 or 16 schools, depending on how you think about it, available in that data source, even if we were to use it. So we're going to use what's known as Prosper. Prosper is a data set that was collected by a team out of Penn State and Iowa that involves 28 schools over a course where they enrolled 2 successive cohorts of students. The study was a randomized control trial of substance use prevention. We're not using the kind of intervention part of the study in our purposes, but it has some other reasons that we're interested in. In particular, it like I said, it enrolled 2 successive cohorts of 6th graders from those schools, equally distributed across the states of various size in the schools. There's some kind of socio-demographic things that reflect the states they're in, not surprisingly. They're potentially problematic, but for our model, it's actually nice that we don't have to deal with that, but I won't worry about that. But what's particularly striking about these is they've been followed those 2 cohorts for 8 weeks. So through graduation, we've got the same set of students studied over that time, starting in 6th grade, like I said, and then annually after that. And they had really high participation and retention rates that are great. And that involved a lot of data, not surprisingly for our purposes, 2 that are particularly important. Friendship nominations. So at each wave, kids could nominate up to 7 friends in their grade. Excuse me, sorry, you have too many data sets floating around in my head. I'm trying to remember. Yeah, this is a grade level specific network. Talk about that later. So that's the first thing across all of the 27 schools, and the 2 cohorts leads us to 54. Then they also, starting at wave 4, asked them about their romantic ties. There's a slight limitation in this respect of Prosper. They only asked them about their their current and or most recent. And I said or because they only could nominate 1 per person. So we're ultimately going to symmetrize this. And what I mean by that is, so if I nominate someone as a romantic partner, we count it, or if they nominate me, we count those equally. And we have some work suggesting that's okay. That doesn't lead us to different kind of interpretations. In fact, Kate Fitch helped do some analysis, actually led the analysis on kind of evaluating that. And I think we're pretty confident that's appropriate in this case. So we're going to think about any nomination on the romantic tie as kind of working in both directions. If either of us say it's there, it's there. These data, like I said, the romantic tie data start being available when they were in the 8th grade. So we're able then to follow that through with one caveat that I'll mention in this respect. And that is that we're going to exclude wave 8. And the reason we're excluding wave 8 is there seemed to be survey fatigue or something going on in this, particularly around the network data, where the response rates were lower and the network data were particularly lower. So we're only going to look at waves 5, 6, and 7 as a result. We also excluded 1 school in this analysis because since we have a question that is really about kind of the available partners that you have, we think of it very different if you have 2 schools at 1 grade and then those kids are in the same school at the next grade. So we are only looking at the schools where either all of those grades are in 1 school or there was only 1 feeder school into the high school. Right? So we exclude the case where there is 2 feeder schools into the same high school because we think of that as a different process for our purposes. So this gives us 27 schools or communities, depending on the way you think about it, by 2 cohorts or 54 networks for 3 waves. That has about 12,000 kids, and the school ranges in size are kind of middling size. I would say they aren't tiny schools, they aren't huge schools. That's the way we can kind of characterize what's going on at the bottom there. That's for now, that part of the description of the data is what I want to mention. Cursorily, I'll come back to a couple of other things in a minute. By way of friendships, on average, they reported about 5 friends per person at the early waves, and that declined to about 4. So it's not a huge decline. And Yeah, I'll just leave it at it's about 4 by the end of the observation window that we're looking at. On average, about 25% of kids were involved in a romantic tie at the first time they could have been, and by the end that had dropped to just under 20%. That we could talk about how much that matters, but for now I'm just kind of giving you a characterization of the data. So the next thing I want to mention is we're going to leverage a modeling framework that comes from Pavel Kritsky and some of his colleagues, including Chris Markham, who is one of the collaborators on this work, of what are known as exponential random family graph models, or usually just exponential random graph models, or ERGMs, for multi-level data. And I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. I'm not going to go like into the kind of full detail of specification of these models, but I want to talk just briefly about kind of what they're trying to do. And what they're trying to do is essentially we're going to say that an observed network, the lowercase y here, is as an instantiation of a class of networks that are characterized by some set of variables we're going to put on the right-hand side. So saying the probability of the network we have, lowercase y, as coming from the family of networks that are available to us, capital Y, can be expressed by a lot of things going on the right. And what those things on the right can entail are any types of network statistics. So we can look at things like homophily that I talked about. We can talk about things like triangles or the tendency to close those. We can put other things in here, and we can have parameters associated with all of those. They can also be kind of network, they can be, individual attributes. So we can have like things like, in this case, gender is the main one we're going to talk about. They could incorporate other things. We're not for the purposes of this. We're simplifying this because estimation is already a bear. Gender is the primary one we're interested in that we'll deal with. But they could be in a number of ways, a lot of different things. I'm not going to talk about kappa. This is where most of us who run ERGMs spend most of our time pulling out our hair because the convergence of these sorts of things was quite difficult. The good news is we can ignore this, in part because of kind of some adjustments that have taken place in the way we model these things over the last 15 years, 10 years? 10 years is where those changes have really kind of happened. You don't need to go through the details of here. I have this to remind myself to tell you that basically what this leads us to is a model that can incorporate things like attributes of people, attributes of their relationships, or structure of those relationships, right? So we can have people and any attributes we wanted to put in there. Again, I said we're only going to look at gender. Attributes of the tie, so things like homophily or similarity on something, in this case, similarity on the friendship relationship or dissimilarity on the romantic relationship by gender, or structural things like triangles. These are important models because you can't estimate these with simple like multi-level models or other things because of the interactions across these things. And individual level dyadic and structural things are nested in ways that are complicated. We're going to use an adaptation that is known as geometrically weighted edgewise shared partners, or what we refer to as GWESP terms, that it basically says that not all triangles are equal. And what I mean by that is, in friendship terms, if I have two friends and the likelihood of them becoming friends is increased by them being jointly my friend, that's going to be more if they have multiple people that are jointly friends with than in other cases. And the same thing matters for our estimation here. So we have to essentially account for the proportion, the number of additional either friendship ties that a relationship would close, or romantic ties, the number of triangles that a single romantic tie would close. So we have to weight a count variable is effectively what this is saying. So we're not just saying count triangles versus not triangles. We're counting how many additional triangles each one of these relationships would close in a weighted form. Probably more technical than we needed to get into, but I just wanted to point out that it's not just looking for the presence or absence, but the counts of them. Now there's a problem. And the problem is that there are models that allow you to estimate these multi-layer networks that I talked about them. So we could have friendships and romantic ties simultaneously in the same model. There are also models that allow you to do ERGMs for longitudinal data, so change in these over time. There, unfortunately, however, are not longitudinal multiplex network data models. So we have to do something to be able to deal with this, since our question is at its core both temporal and multiplex, because we're thinking about prior relationships predicting future relationships in a multiplex context. So we have to come up with a solution for that. And our solution was basically to kind of build into the multi-layer model logics that account for the temporality of the data. And what I mean by this is basically we can say that we can look for a romantic tie at time 6 or time 7, dependent upon whether or not there was a romantic tie between the other pair, ij, at a previous time 5 and 6. And we can think about time 5 romantic network as one layer, time 6 romantic network as another layer, time 5 friendship tie as a layer, time 6 friendship. All that to say, we effectively have in our data 6 layers instead of 2 layers, because our layers now are relationship time combinations instead of just relationships. And this is the way that we get around this problem of the model not having a model that can do both of these simultaneously, is since ours are panel data, we can think of these as discrete times anyway. And so treating them as panels and as separate layers in that fashion is okay. So we're gonna basically predict 2 things. The first, the yellow doesn't show up on your screen. It shows up on mine. It's very yellow. The thing at the bottom is the first version of this is predicting, as we said, the avoidance of a romantic tie between K and J, given that they are friends, that K and I are friends, and I and J were previously in a romantic relationship. The alternative version that we're going to predict here is simply if I and J were in a romantic relationship, no longer are, but K and J do form a romantic tie, what happens to the friendship relationship between I and K, right? We can do this. I'll point out something that we were talking about earlier in one of our conversations about how we're dealing with time here. We tried this 2 different ways, and the 2 different ways that we're dealing with time in our models are effectively asking the question of, okay, so a relationship that existed at time 5 breaks up at time 6, what happens at time 7, or what happens if at time 5 the relationship breaks up before time 6 at 6 or 7. You could think of this as like, is it an immediate kind of avoidance, or is it like a durable avoidance is the way we're testing it. And the reason I'm going to kind of scoot past that is it doesn't matter. If we try it both ways, the results are the same. But those are the only kind of combination of temporal possibilities we could have in our data. On that relationship. Similarly, there's kind of 2 different ways time can formulate on the friendship relationship. We estimate them both patterns the same. It doesn't matter how we deal with it. We get the same answer. The second thing I want to mention with respect to how we go about this kind of modeling question is when you have 54 networks effectively, what do you do with them? One possibility is that you run 54 models and you average effects or do something across them. That there's a lot of reasons not to do that. We approach what is known as a pooled likelihood approach here, where we basically take everything and treat it as a single network statistically, but then we can specify in it that no relationships can happen across schools. So you basically just have kind of, if you think schools on the diagonal, we basically have a model that excludes all the out of school possibilities. So it's a single model estimating this effect. And the main reason we do it this way is we're assuming an effect that should operate effectively similarly across contexts. We're not assuming that the context necessarily should look different across schools, which would suggest we should do it the other way if that was what we assumed. We have played around with doing it the other way. It's really hard. But so theoretically, we actually think this is the right way, but we try the other way just to think about it as a robustness check. A lot of the schools just don't have enough kind of data to be able to estimate very stably. This is both the kind of theoretically more consistent way and pragmatically the one that makes more sense. So the last thing I'll say before I get into kind of any results about the model is we do add some control level sorts of things in here, and I'm going to mention 2. One is just some people have different tendencies to form ties, be they friendship or romantic relationships, so we have to account for that. Second, in order to date a friend's ex, I have to have friends who have exes, right? So I have to control for what are known as those 2-star effects. I can't, do that without that opportunity. Or similarly, if I have an ex and they are dating one of my friends, I have to have, and they're dating someone to have the alternative process. We have to have been friends in the first place for that to be relevant to our question. So that's what these 2-star effects are. The big caveat that I have to mention here is ideally we would have gender homophily terms in these models, right? And so we would have gender homophily terms in these models on the friendship ties, expecting that people's friendships are more likely to be same gender, and we would have gender homophily terms in the romantic tie data to expect that most romantic relationships would be heterosexual. Unfortunately, we're having severe convergence issues in that regard, and so we don't have these in them. And I will talk about the implications of not having those in the models I'm presenting today when I get into the results. We're still working on it, still trying to get it to work. Yeah, convergence has been a problem on the gender inclusion maps. So those are the kind of main things that I wanted to mention with respect to the models. So going back to these kind of descriptives, I can ask the question of kind of how many of each of these just do we see in the first place? And it can give us a couple kind of characterizations. First and foremost, I'm asking, oops, those are not supposed to step out. There still should be question marks. These dashed lines are telling me how many times when I and J were in a romantic relationship at time 1, and there was a friendship between I and K at time 1, when that romantic tie dissolves and the friendship retains, what happens at the bottom? This is irrespective of the base. This is not saying that they do date or they don't. This is saying how many can I compare? So there are a little over 21,000 possible comparisons on the top. On the bottom, this is the scenario where this relationship has ended, this relationship has formed. Now we're asking the question of how many of these are likely to be closed. So there's about a little less than 4,000 that we can look at. First thing I want to point out with respect to this is basically telling you can compare across these and basically say that only about 1 in 7, 1 in 6 times that they have the possibility of forming that relationship, do they? Now, what happens with the friendship is a separate question. So I'm going to use that as kind of possibly is kind of some tempering on the kind of multi-variable version of our results, because this would be more consistent with the pattern of the prohibition on the romantic tie than our models suggest. This is where I'm going to have to caveat some things. So our primary finding on the version of the multi-layer exponential random graph model that estimates whether or not people form the romantic tie at the bottom. So when the prior romantic tie is gone, when the previous romantic tie is dissolved and the friendship retains, we find a strong and positive effect on the base romantic tie here. So this is saying that people do tend to date their friends' exes, and substantially more than we might expect. This is where the red is intentional here. You should read this with a huge caveat. I don't trust this finding yet. And I can tell you that with some simulation work and some just kind of calculating the possible scenarios at just a descriptive level, it does seem to tend in the positive direction, but whether or not this is significant once we control for those kind of opportunities and how they intersect with individual characteristics, we think that the inability to estimate this with the gender homophily terms appropriately, particularly on the romantic tie layer, is likely inflating this effect. I'm not sure whether it's going to inflate it to the point where it is changed or it just goes away. But the evidence we have suggests that it would be hard pressed for it to have flipped the sign, if you will. So all that to say, I think that it is very likely that there is that this norm is at minimum overstated. Whether or not people are tending to kind of follow the alternative hypothesis of closing these triangles or dating our friends' exes more than we would expect is the part of this I probably don't trust just yet. However, and perhaps for me more interestingly, is there is a strong tendency for when people do date their friends' exes for those friendships to dissolve. And if we work out the combinations of kind of what this comparison is not excluding by not having the gender term appropriately being specified, it actually doesn't constrain in the same way. And or said the other way, once we get those to converge, I don't anticipate this one will change much at all. It might kind of marginally change, but it should not affect this particular finding in the same way that it affects the top finding. So that's as we continue to try and get these kind of gender homophily terms to appropriately specify in ways that allows us to estimate this conditioning on those things, we'll see where it goes. I suspect this one will hold up. It's still open question on whether the owner will hold up or not. I think that's the main thing I'll say with respect to that. So if we think about interpretation, and this is where I think this becomes somewhat interesting for us, is that the pattern as a whole was followed, and that is that the forbidden triad isn't there, right? It is relatively avoided. The question is, why is it avoided? And this is the part where we're still trying to work it out. As currently, it seems to suggest that the alternate hypothesis accounts for the romantic tie findings, that people do tend to date their friends' exes, maybe because of constrained opportunity, maybe because of other things. And straightforwardly, the friendship tie findings tend to support the primary hypothesis, and that is that we do avoid these kind of open two paths by dissolving friendships with people who date our exes. Other things, the kind of base, the kind of two-star opportunities and the number of ties people have tend to kind of have distributions as we would expect them. which could lead us to conclude potentially the popular perception is overstated, maybe because there are limited opportunities, or maybe because of kind of what's going on and who I'm aware of might kind of override any norms. But what I'm more compelled by here is the second part of the finding, and that is that a lot of times when we talk about norms, we talk about them not as like how well do people follow them, but what are the consequences of them. And often we have more established things to suggest that norms are more well known because we sanction people when they violate them. And that would be very consistent with what we're observing in the second part of the finding here. And that's why I'm a little bit more compelled by the part that I also think is more robust. But for what it's worth, I think this is something we should, in a number of ways, anticipate. It's also possible, so this is getting a little deep in the weeds. Probably, I don't know how many of you kind of work in the network world. If you do, exponential random graph models treat time, or in the way we've kind of done this layering, treats time in such a way that thinks about ties as relatively stable or static sorts of things, and we're just thinking about change as something that is possible over kind of longer, or said another, we're thinking of the relationships as potentially or likely to be usefully treated as though they are stable type things. I forget who I was talking to earlier about this, but romantic ties at certain ages may not be really best thought of in that way. So there's another modeling framework we could be used differently. It would have an even bigger problem with the multiplexity in the like stochastic actor-based modeling framework. So we're not going that direction, but Ergem is imposing an assumption here that these are at least theoretically and conceptually kind of potentially stable relationships, which may or may not apply in romantic ties amongst high schoolers. We could debate that, whether it's inappropriate. But it's the best we've got at the moment. So restating the kind of findings here, the limitations that I want to highlight in particular is this one nomination thing is definitely constraining. The good thing, the one thing that in that only people at any one wave could only nominate one romantic tie. Periodically, they were nominated by multiple others. So we do have a distribution. We don't just have zeros or ones. That's what I'm trying to say there. So it's not a like huge limitation, but it's some of the best data we have to be able to address this. But the model capabilities are definitely being strained here. When we started this project, I'm not exaggerating, there were 2 people in the world who knew how to run this model. Chris was one of them. That's why he's involved in the paper. This is now taken a while, so there are more people who can, and this type of model is now kind of publicly available to run. We're still trying to figure out if we can get it to kind of work better. Chris left academia. He was working in the White House on data sharing and privacy issues for a while, so he was not involved in it for a while in some of this, and we're trying to kind of revisit this, which this talk give us the opportunity to revisit. So I'll just mention that we're still trying to kind of get that. I guess the takeaway I would say is that at least partially there seems to be some veracity to the publicly perceived norm, but exactly how we arrive at it is somewhat up in the air, given our kind of my lack of confidence in our primary findings. So that's where I planned to leave off. And thank you all, and happy to talk about whatever we can.
We have some time for questions.
So I understand the multiplex problem. But my question is probably a multiplex problem. People you sort of infer that I'm friends with Bob and I'm dating Susan. So Susan and Bob can't be friends. But in your previous time group, Bob may have nominated Susan as a friend, and I'm wondering whether you're controlling for any of those prior friend nominations for the person that they become romantically involved. I mean, like, I know that's a multiplex problem, but there may be something else. I mean, if they're all in the same friend group, how is that playing out? Are you able to address that?
I have 2 answers to the question. The first is, as a control, we have it. Right. So the like friend possibility between them is something that like we aren't specifying who the friends are. I just did in presentation form. For the models, it is possible that they are friends. So that's the first step. The second step is something we aren't empirically testing, in part because Derek Krieger and his team have already done this out of Prosper, is whether or not those kind of previous friendships are likely to convert, if you will, into romantic ties. And the reason we aren't worried about the kind of way you described it is because they find empirically that's not the way it tends to work. People tend to avoid one of the avoidances they found is their paper is called Friends First with the big question mark. The question was, do people date people who they were already friends with. So is friendship kind of a step to a romantic tie? And they found on average that it was much more likely in these, and coming straight from these data, that romantic ties are coming from non-friends rather than from friends. So the like conditioning version of the question, rather than just the controlling version of the question, is not something that we felt concerned with dealing with, given their previous findings in that regard. But yeah, absolutely, it's an important question. And I'm sorry if I oversimplified in the presentation, but we are able to at least control for that consideration. Please.
So, remind me, like the setting of, did it say rural areas? So my question is, you know, in rural areas, it's more socially isolated, schools are smaller, you might have like dating options. So like compared to like an urban area, we have more opportunities to meet people. And so like, what are your thoughts about that? Do you think the finding to be different in that setting?
Yeah.
So not just thinking about that, like, only so many options. If you only have like a class of like 20 people, and you know.
Yeah, this is where like network. This is there's again, I probably have more than two, but I'll limit myself to two kind of responses to this. And the first is, I absolutely think that I wouldn't try and generalize this beyond this case in this particular, because of exactly what you're saying. I think that one of the reasons I lean on the kind of opportunity constraint interpretation of the finding initially is because of exactly what you said. Now, whether or not it's as strong as it is, I have reason to doubt. But the second thing is, like, this is something that we as network scholars have probably done as a detriment to ourselves. And this is, and what I mean by that is we like to study closed populations. And the reason we like to study closed populations is because it's good to infer kind of how structure is bounded by whatever the population is that we're studying. But in so doing, what we've often done is excluded what external influences might alter these things. And so I would say, absolutely, that's my anticipation. I'd love to investigate it. We have almost no data that would let us do that. And I've been one who like advocates that I'd be interested in trying to find sources that allow us to think about this. So I should think about this as very much constrained to the population that I'm talking about, and whether those extensions are kind of urban rural, or as soon as we go from high schools to college or other age groups, you know, where those boundaries become more permeable. I fully expect we might think about these as fundamentally different processes, but for our purposes, at least at this level, I think it's a good kind of base demonstration of like what it could look like. I don't have any, I have many reasons to suspect that you're right, that as soon as we carry this into less isolated settings, we might find very different patterns. To give you a sense, the first time I tried to explore this question was actually to give you kind of a even stronger picture of the way we in the networks world like to work on isolated populations, was from an island, a set of island studies in Malawi, where we were looking at communities that were truly isolated from one another. Which is nice for like theoretical simplicity and explanatory kind of constraints, but it isn't for generalizability in the way you're talking. Please.
Yeah, really enjoyed the talk. So one, like, friendship is 7 nominations, and it's a dichotomous variable. So in these schools that are small, like everybody knows each other.
Right.
You can imagine that friendship is really like a continuous variable going from 1, like we're friends, always 0, like and then -1, like we're not friends. And then in some ways, you showed triangles, but really it's like imagine like a friendship cluster. And each one of those is like a little bubble, and not everybody in that cluster is going to nominate each other just because of the limitations on how many people can nominate. But you can imagine that if you break this norm, one possibility is that in that cluster, maybe nobody, maybe it's okay, and you're still in the cluster. But another one would be like breaking that norm, breaking that taboo. Like you then move outside the cluster, and people, not just the person that's your friend, but other people in the cluster don't nominate you. And so that might be observable. Like you're an isolate, or you join another clique, like you wonder whether you might get some, given the limitations of data, you don't know who's not friends, but you would sort of see who sort of shifts the cluster that they're part of. I wonder if that might give you a little more leverage on what could be going on.
Yeah. So I promise I don't always do this, but I have 2 answers to your question. It's not always there's 2 answers, but I do have 2 answers. They don't get us all the way to answering a question that you're raising that is very important, but it gives us partially. The first is, the reason I go back here is to the way a GWESP term works is effectively we're thinking about not just comparing single triangles, and we're comparing like how many triangles in a weighted form on the friendship, and both of these are specified in this way. So on the friendship level in particular, we know how those tend to behave, and we've tuned that parameter in a lot of different ways, and this seems to be robust to how that tuning works. So So it seems to not be dependent upon kind of how clustered their friend group is effectively the way you could interpret what I'm saying. That's the first version. I still don't think it gets all the way there. A second version is we did specify models at one point. I don't have them in front of me, but we did specify models at one point that constrained this only to the first friendship nomination, because we know that people tend, when we ask survey questions like this, to order their kind of friendships, not exactly, but more or less in kind of strength of relationship, at least to the point that like a first can often be thought of as a best friend, and whether or not this would be different for best friends versus any friend. And we didn't really see a strong pattern of difference on the best friend version of the models, for whatever that's worth. Again, I would interpret with particularly the romantic part of it with a heavy caveat, but to your point about how it affects the friendship tie, I think it might be more problematic in the friend group if the people who are really close than the people who are less close violate this. So I think that helps us a little bit with respect to that. I still think there's some space in between the two answers I just gave and the question you're raising, but I don't know how we would get at that space, unfortunately, with these data in some of the ways that it's constrained. But we tried as best we know how. And we did specify these are quite a few different ways just at this level for what it's was to get at some of these, both in terms of temporal variation and these sorts of things. Thanks. Sorry,
Sorry. No, it's okay. So there's a lot of what ifs that you could do
Yep.
with this. Just in thinking about what I know about adolescence, is there like a situation where, so you have the norm violating relationship, you have the dissolution of the friendship. The friend who's not in that norm violating relationship, are they able to pursue their friend's ex without that being seen as a
Right.
taboo? Like I'm kind of thinking about retaliation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Trying to figure out how we would structure that in, because that becomes effectively you're now outside the triangle. Yeah. And those types of configurational things are estimable in ergoms. I have a hard time believing we'd be able to estimate it in this context. We might be able to like pull them apart. Part of what we've done here is we pulled these apart into kind of separate models, and we might be able to pull that apart into a separate model. It's not something that is absolutely, I see where you're going. It's not something we've considered. I'm also sitting here trying to think about, because the way I presented it is though we're focusing on triangles, but what we're actually looking at is the closure, the formation of a tie. And I'm just constraining the way I'm talking about which tie it is comparing against. And what I'm trying to say is your combination might actually implicitly be in ours. I don't think it is, but this is why I don't know whether to trust our like simulated and kind of isolated tests of that first effect, or this kind of multi-level is how these things combine is really complex in networks. So like, I suspect we aren't getting at your question as the short version. And I think it'd be interesting to do. I'm not sure how well we'd be able to do it, unfortunately, but it's possible we are like backdooring our way into an answer to that question. I'd have to work out the implications because that's not what I've thought about, but I see. We thought about the sequencing question more in the like, is there like start stop, or their long-term effects, or their kind of delayed effects, or are they like effects that only last for a certain amount of time, but kind of how they carry over to other relationships. I don't have a good sense of whether or not we could explore that here. Either. Am I supposed to?
Oh, my question is around how much you can actually tease out with respect to age, because I know you said that you have these as separate layers, and I think maybe that was our conversation that we were having. I wondered, as these relationships start forming at older ages, they start to take on different characteristics, and this is also inspired. I recently chaperoned a middle school dance. And a lot of jumping around, and there's some symbolic dating, but it's not at the same level of emotional and physical intimacy that might drive some of the taboos that we see. And I really wonder if you could potentially put some more specificity around this theoretical proposition by looking at when it does become a little bit more mature of a relationship, there's a stronger taboo.
Yeah. So there's a lot that we could potentially think about with respect to this. This is one of the moments where I'm going to lean on a limitation and a constraint on the data as potentially a benefit to us. Is effectively, we're only looking at a 2-year window in where these effects could be observed. And so like, that is like how much, I'm not suggesting 2 years isn't enough for there to be changing dynamics, but effectively like we don't have the kind of full range where some of these might really be different. And so that I think might help us in some respects. I absolutely think you're right that there are likely to be dynamics. I don't know over what like age that we would think about them. The real problem that I have, unfortunately, with this is, and this is something that I've been, at least since I wrote my Social Green book, probably before that, trying to shout as loudly as I can about in the network community, is there has been a weird move in networks to move from studying kind of schools and networks among schools to studying networks of grade level or networks of classroom. And so in this case, there's no possibility of relationships that go in this study, there's no possibility of any relationships that go across grade. They constrained it in such a way that they were asking about friends in your grade and romantic ties in your grade. There are a few people who did kind of report outside of that, but you know, those effectively get excluded from our analysis. So that's different than your question, but I also think there's like not just grade variation in kind of how this progresses across age, but I think there's also grade variation, as we know, in romantic ties, girls tend to date on average slightly older boys than themselves, for example, that we aren't able to get at that part of the age dynamic as well. So we don't have, I mean, by looking at, I guess the other thing I would say is by looking at this question is both kind of what happens at wave 6 and what happens at wave 7 and seeing effectively the same result. I think if I were to analyze it as an age specific question, I don't think we would find a difference in this case because of the way we've already kind of looked at the data. But I totally buy your like explanation that I just don't know that we could test it here is the unfortunate thing. And if we could, or I should say, if we could test it, I don't think in this case, because of the constraints on our data, that we would find that there is evidence in either way in that regard. That's the best way to say that.
Can you quickly just remind me how old? So you started collecting romantic ties in 8th grade. Wave 5 was 9th grade. So this is actually not.
So we're actually looking at 9, 10, 11 is effectively the way you can think about it.
So
I don't remember why we excluded an 8. There was probably a logic. This is where I'd have to go back to my thing. There is only 3 waves in ours. Yeah, but it's 9, 10, 11. It's effectively the grade levels that we are, even though there is. Oh, I remember why. 8, there were effectively none. The number of romantic ties that were being reported in the 8th grade were actually like so comparative. It was a qualitatively different thing that we were looking at. That is why there's a distributional difference that we excluded that.
So
And the school, and the other reason is the school transition thing. If we're fitting it as a single model, as we probably, if we did include 8th grade or 9th grade, excuse me, in there, we have schools where 9th is in middle school and we have schools where 9th is in high school. And so we would have had to split our sample analytically to allow for those differences in ways. So I think we had some pragmatic constraints on why we excluded 9th grade or 8th grade, excuse me. I keep saying the wrong numbers.
But that makes more sense. I think maybe I was a little bit confused about the age range that it's actually being measured here. So you are having relationships that are more.
Yeah, you can think of it effectively as we're looking at the effects in the 10th and 11th grade years.
Okay.
Is the results is when we have like the outcomes that we're actually testing against here is the only years we're really looking at. Sorry, yeah, thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, so I'm curious about the population of students that you're following. And I am guessing that it's the same group year to year, which means that people who leave drop out, but also people who come are not incorporated. And I would believe it if you said to me, well, there isn't that much of that going on in rural schools, but there probably is some. So you probably don't know the answer to this question. So I'm going to ask you to speculate. The new kid,
Right.
are they the new date or the new friend?
That's a great question. You're right. I would be speculating. But before I would speculate, I would say that the retention and participation rates are, and the way they kind of define things are such that we do know that it's rare. There aren't a lot of new kids in these schools proportionally, but that doesn't mean that they wouldn't factor in the ways you're raising. I actually don't remember in Prosper how they get included in the data collection process. This is something I should know the answer to, but I just don't remember. To be frank, this is where Molly is our Prosper expert. So what I believe they subsequently are interviewed. In some studies they aren't, but I believe in this case they are. So we might be able to look at that. But I think that before I would answer a question, I'd be interested in knowing like how integrated they are in the data collection, not just like the potential nominee process. As far as the actual answer to the question. Oh, man, I would be punting. This is
Oh,
where I would
good.
land.
I'm curious to know. I mean, you've got
Yeah.
these very dense friendship networks,
Right.
so maybe you would argue they're the new date, because
Right.
nobody has to realign
Right.
friendships, right?
Yeah.
Or not. I don't know. That's.
Now I want to go back and read Derek's paper to see Derek, that team's paper, because I bet they had to speculate an answer to this question in regard, because they are really concerned with the sequencing in more ways. I guess the way I would say this, their paper would lead, if I had to speculate, their paper would lead me to suspect the friendship groups are harder to break into than, if romantic ties really are being drawn from non-friends, then the kind of like consolidation process is more likely to constrain who your friends are than it is to constrain who your romantic ties are. But that's probably a little more spitballing than I'm glad I said that I only want this as a private link. I'll put that on YouTube for that purpose.
So your wonderful meme that you use has this sort of context of both gender and sexuality
yeah.
because it's girls and feminism and talking about boyfriends. So I'm curious how that's accounted for here, if it's accounted, and would you expect maybe to find a stronger effect in what you might argue is more of the strong norm?
So let me answer back to my two answers. The first version is we were able to get a model to converge that had gender as a node level covariate. So that's to say controlling for gender didn't change our effects. We do not have an interaction term that effectively thinks about whether or not individuals, but effectively, if you really think about the specification at a network level of what a homophily term incorporates, a homophily term is effectively an interaction term of node level covariates. So once we can get that, we will be able to speak to the answer to your question. I can tell you what it currently is suggesting, and it currently is suggesting that we don't anticipate a difference, but I would need to know that before I then put, if I had a model that has both a node level covariate of gender and once I get the homophily term to converge, we'll be able to address that more concretely. But it's currently, I would not expect from our findings that it is, and this is an interesting, as I went out looking for like examples that I would throw into my slides, they were all almost gendered, even though we know there are versions of both the vulgar and the kind of popular perceptually held versions of it that are both directions, for whatever that is worth. In the back.
Hi, I don't know if you captured or considered this, but maybe you could comment on it. I'm thinking about triangles that maybe close in a different way. So I is friends with K is friends with J, and then maybe
Introduce.
forms between I and J, or lines that maybe overlap. So something like I is friends with K, I is in a relationship with J, and then K becomes friends with J.
Yeah. So the second one I can answer, that is one that is answered effectively in the other paper that was mentioned by Krieger et al. Like they would find that that's not going to change what we're doing because of the kind of sequencing. The first part of your question of these kind of, what are the processes of closure and kind of the sequencing of those things? We could, and we didn't, we honestly aren't currently consider. So you now have me puzzling. Ergoms are a complicated thing, and sometimes what you are controlling for isn't as immediately apparent as you realize. And effectively, we're looking at ties and predicting these things. We aren't conditioning when you intersect a node level thing with in our two-path term. It doesn't matter whether we are thinking about the romantic tie as kind of following from or kind of a part of the conditioning in the way you described as different from the kind of reverse order. It would effectively make the same interacting prediction in the way we're controlling for those two things. So while we aren't expressing it, I actually think we're excluding the first possibility here in ways that would be consistent with what you're asking, or including depending on the way I think about it. I think we're getting at that one. I'd have to be sure. This is where part of the reason convergence on ergoms is so complicated is that like you often don't know how your terms are interacting and combining with one another in ways that express themselves consistent with exactly your consideration. And so I'm thinking we might be getting that already. Okay, it's not kind of happening, but I would want to double check. Temporally, maybe not. I'm not sure.
Okay.
I would be.
Because I'm thinking about if they are already friends and then that relationship dissolves, would it be more likely?
For who is it worse, the friendship or the romantic tie? Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a really good, a good way of thinking about it. Yeah. Sorry. ending up in personal experience in my brain now that I'm like, oh God. The divorced friends you introduced is what I'm having in my brain right now. Sorry.
That you only had about 25%, I think, that actually had relationships. I wondered whether you lacked variability in that kind of outcome.
Yeah, we're
And
right.
if those people are different, and I guess I'm just wondering, maybe you need to do this with older
Yeah.
kid or college kids. I mean, something, I'm just wondering if you don't have the variability that you need, because that group is selective.
But believe it or not, this is an incredibly considered compared to a lot of what we're often dealing with in our world. This now the one thing I would say is simply that's a hard translation from I skipped over that thing of kappa when I was talking about an ergum, and what I was skipping over there is how many. Remember, this is effectively a tie level. It's actually a network level model that is expressed as a tie level model. And what I'm saying with respect to that is, by my in here is effectively not in terms of people is not 11,000. It's effectively 11,000 times 11,000 divided by 2 in terms of the friendships. Well, not entirely true because it's constrained in school. Inside any school, I should say, a school of 500, it's not 500, it's 25, it's 1250, right? Is 25,000 divided by 2, 12,500. Sorry. But what I'm trying to say is the relationships that are available scale in a square effectively. And so we have more comparisons than it might seem immediately possible, but you're right, at the romantic tie, we still have few. What I'm trying to say is we have actually a lot that we're able to deal with here compared to what we often have in most network studies. Yeah, would I like bigger? For sure. But the process in terms of what it would look like across schools, I don't, yeah, I don't know how much the kind of limits on possible is likely to be driving, particularly our romantic tie. There seemed to be plenty of opportunity there for in any direction. The friendship, ironically, this leads me to wonder about our friendship tie question, the second question, a little bit more than it does the first one. But
Except, I mean, I'm thinking about my daughters weren't in any relationships, but maybe
Right.
Bob's were in a lot of relationships.
right.
So nothing personal. I'm just using an example here. But the point is that there are some kids that might be contributing a lot of those relationships
Yes.
and others that aren't. And I'm just wondering about lack of variability
Yes.
potentially. I mean,
Yes.
just
Yeah. This is where hopefully this is where we're getting past the kind of power problem by pooling things. And so we're not, if we were running individual school level models, exactly what you're raising is probably why half of our models never converged. And so we're hoping that some of that those kind of individual level or node level covariates that might lead to more partners or fewer partners at that level are kind of similar across contexts. It might be a terrible assumption, but that allows us to kind of power up in that regard. But I don't know the answer in that regard. That's a good point.
Oh, just
I don't know what you else. I'll follow you
We'll have one more question.
I'm happy to do whatever.
Well, just so for the main result again, at the moment, it's that you're currently more likely to
Yeah, your friends
X.
But then when you do, friends drop.
Yeah.
More, and it's not more like, it's not that that's the more likely it's that the base comparison is effectively then forming a relationship with somebody else, right? Is what we're comparing here. It's not form it versus not. It is then form a relationship with somebody else.
One of the challenges I think in interpreting is we're not seeing which is also because these ergo models are so complicated. We're not seeing the other controls, because you mentioned because the question is compared to who,
right?
I think the challenge is you said that there's not a lot of friend to partner movements, but what about friend of friend or friend of friend?
Well, that we're controlling.
It's there's a broader, because I think there's a powerful force that you're more likely to date somebody that you sort of are aware of, even if you're not directly a friend. And so compared to somebody who's totally disconnected and unknown, yeah, you're more likely to date your ex, but what about somebody who's sort of in the friendship circle and you're aware of?
Yeah, I skipped over some additional controls that are in the model, just kind of general tendencies to form, to form friendships, general tendencies to form romantic ties. And effectively what you're talking about is a two-star effect that is not the 2-star effect that we're interested in, but it's another 2-star effect that is joint with, that is well, half overlapping with the one we're interested in. And we do have those controlled for in the model. Now, whether or not that interacts with, we couldn't test that. It's like we'd have no power to be able to test that. But like whether or not that is kind of conditioning the possibility, whether or not that is independent of the possibility is in our model, even though I skipped over that. I have here. I did not present the table version because I'm teaching a biz class and I just told my students don't present table versions and these sorts of things. But there's oh, I stopped sharing. There are quite a few 2-star terms in here, including the one you're raising, is what I'm trying to point out, and as well as a number of other kind of things in our models that I did not mention at all as controls.
All right, well, thank you so much. This is great.
Thank you all.